What's going on, guys? Abrasus here. So today we have a topic that was heavily suggested since my last chaff video. I think that this is a pretty easy subject and pretty intuitive. I don't want to make a big video out of it, but I will give you some small tips on chaff positioning and some things that you should consider when thinking where to put your chaff. So first of all, you should answer the simple question: how much do you need the chaff in particular game? In different matchups, chaff has different roles, and sometimes it's much more important, sometimes it's much less important. Sometimes you can allow your chaff to go hunting your opponent's war machines, and sometimes you just need the chaff to chaff opponent units. So the rule of the thumb is if your opponent has a heavy close combat army, then you need your chaff much more. But if your opponent has a more heavy shooting army, then the chaff is less needed and less likely to survive. So this is the second point that I want to make. How can your opponent kill your chaff? So if your opponent doesn't have much shooting, doesn't have much ranged threats from magic, then your chaff is pretty easy to position, right? You don't have to pay much attention to it, you just need it to be able to chaff. So it is most likely the frontline unit, right? On the other hand, if your opponent has lots of shooting, but you need your chaff anyways, for the purposes of one or two bigger units your opponent has, then you have to be pretty careful with that. Right, you have to abuse the terrain, you have to abuse your own units, and pay much attention to the positioning of your chaff. The most interesting case is when your opponent has a little bit of shooting and magic, so he cannot really kill your chaff units in one turn, but he can probably do it in two turns. So what I would suggest doing here is trying to make sure that the chaff is always ready to chaff. Why is it so? Because if your chaff is not ready to chaff and your opponent manages to sneak some wounds in, then the next turn he will be able to finish it off, and he will practically kill your chaff for free. On the other hand, if your chaff is always in position to chaff, then even if he does 2 or 3 wounds to your chaff, it doesn't reduce the capabilities of the chaff as much. Hence, you would just use the chaff, and then this is the very good way to discourage him from even shooting at the chaff in the first place. Because he always will notice that even if he kills 2 or 3 guys from the unit, then this unit is still usable in its primary role. So let's move to 2 very important rules for positioning chaff. The first one is safe but useful. Obviously, you can hide your chaff units at the end of the battlefield, or behind the impassable terrain, or in places where it won't be shot definitely. But this makes no sense, because then it most likely will not fulfill its role. What I mean by useful is in the position where it can chaff your opponent, and what is very important is that you have to remember that your opponent will have his turn before your next turn to move your chaff. So you have to be able to chaff your opponent after he moves, not before he moves. So if you are measuring ranges of your chaff, then remember that your opponent can do any weird kinds of reforms or just marches. So measure the chaff range after his actual movement, not before. So there are several types of chaff, and different chaff types like different kinds of units to protect them. So for example, dogs that you can see on the left like to be protected by things like forests, fields, often ruins, because they cannot go through any unit, they don't have light troops. So you have to be very careful to not chaff your own chaff and block it from fulfilling its role. The second type is the best chaff in the game, which is kind of furies or harpies or gargoyles, basically any flying chaff. And you can position it anywhere, but pay attention to not overdo it and not hide them too far back, because I myself faced this problem a few times in my games, that I thought, yeah, 20-inch march, I can chaff everywhere. But then when it comes to the longer charges and the different angles of the battlefield, it might still be hard to get the good movement on this unit. So always pay attention to what is happening. And then the third unit is light troops chaff, so sirens or dark riders or any kind of this stuff. It can find the best place behind your larger units, so like crusher cavalry. It cannot really hide behind smaller units, but they can grant them cover, so this is also nice. and in contrary to things like warhounds or dire wolves, they can pretty easily go out from behind of the units. So this is the big advantage, and they usually have lots of movement, so this is not a problem. So that's what I also mentioned in one of the previous videos. I would always try to have at least one unit of the more conservative chaff, so either the harpies or the dark riders kind of thing, just to make sure that I will always find myself with the chaff when I need it. But I think that bringing more than one unit is not really necessary, because you are denying your list other elements that are crucial, like the combat capabilities or shooting abilities and of magic capabilities. And if you are playing smart, then you don't really need more than one unit of the chaff for the sake of chaff. And second thing that I would like to point out is that you should give your opponent dilemmas, that you should always try to think from the opponent's perspective what he will do. And you know, I've been playing lately with armies that are pretty soft, like Demon Legions or Dread Elves, and I was always pretty happy when my opponent was shooting at my chaff, because my chaff was relatively safe, so still he couldn't kill the whole unit in one turn, he could only wound it a bit, but at the same time he wasn't shooting at my main unit, which was either Bloodletters or the Dancers of Yema, both units which are pretty fragile, and even getting few bodies off this unit can be really harmful, because remember, you don't always need to kill the whole opponent's block to be able to fight it, but it's sometimes enough to just kill some of it, like a third of it, maybe half of it, so it becomes not able to fight your own units. So you have to put yourself in your opponent's perspective and think, what will you do if you were him? And if you want to save your chaff, then make sure that if you were him, you would not be shooting at the chaff. So for example, here you have the Ogre Bombardiers that could shoot either at the Harpies or at the Sirens, but the Harpies are guaranteed to be at long range and with the skirmish. So basically this is 2 more penalty than for shooting at Sirens, and most Ogre players would probably choose to shoot at Sirens. Of course, this depends also on the rest of the bot situation, but in general I would say that this would be the choice. So I would say that it is good that you give your opponents not a automatic choice to shoot here or automatic choice to shoot here. For example, if you put your Dancers of Yema in the playing field and then you put your Harpies in the ruins, then obviously your opponent will shoot at Dancers of Yema, right? But if you put the Dancers of Yema in the forest and then put the Harpies in the forest, then maybe this is not such a good choice. So you should always try to equalize these things, because if they are pretty much similar in risk, then any decision your opponent takes is equally right and equally wrong at the same time. So you don't want to give him obvious choices. With the chaff, especially if you want to keep it a bit longer, then sometimes it is even good to put your units out of the cover on purpose, just so your opponent is more tempted by shooting at your other units than he is shooting at your chaff. Okay, so let's go to the summary of what I talk about in this video. First of all, the chaff units are not important in every game, because not every opponent wants to go into combat with you, not every opponent has big blocks to block. Not every matchup is very close range based, sometimes it's just a shooting duel where the chaff is only giving out points. Second point, maybe I didn't talk about this previously in the video, but I will talk about this now. You have to always measure the ranges of opponent threats, especially with the new demons coming out. You need to always ask, what is the range? What is the maximum range? Sometimes you want to be outside of the maximum range, but often because you need to be able to use your chaff, so the chaff needs to be useful, you should be at least within a range of the shots after your opponent moves, so at least he has some penalty for that. The third thing is that terrain and the units are most important, but it depends on which chaff type you are using, to which terrains and what units can help you with protecting it. Next point is that the chaff needs to be useful after your opponent moves, not before, so always measure what your opponent can do in his next turn, so you will be able to chaff him after his next moves. And the last point that I talked about a second before is that if your opponent has some shooting, has some ranged magic, always give him dilemmas. Give him several choices to point out, all good choices or all equally bad choices. It depends on the board, but he needs to have some choices to make. Because if he doesn't have choices to make, if he only has one choice to make, he will always be right. If he has 3 choices to make, he will be wrong in 2 cases out of 3, right? So now the promised outro roll. This comes from my own gameplay of the Darkest Dungeon game. You can find the link to the game and to some videos down in the description. I highly recommend you checking it out if you are interested in video games. I think this is one of the best games I've played. And while it has nothing to do with the 9th Age concept, I think the undermining values that you need and undermining principles are pretty much the same that you use in the 9th Age. So that's very interesting in my opinion. See you in the next video. Cheers!